Okay, let's go over this quiz problem by problem. Alright, let's start with problem number 1. Again, every time you get ready to try to classify, we have all these quadrilaterals. Using length and slope, we're supposed to decide which one of these 7 quadrilaterals it is. But at first glance, I don't want you to think about all 7. I want you just to think about the top 3. Is it a parallelogram? Is it a trapezoid? Or is it a kite? That's it. Parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Okay, in diagram form, it's going to look like this. Is it a parallelogram? Is it a trapezoid? Or is it a kite? Okay, so let's take a look. So looking at problem number 1, our first question is it a parallelogram? Let's just get that out of the way. Now, if it's a parallelogram, the definition of a parallelogram is opposite sides should be parallel. One of the properties, though, is that opposite sides should be congruent. Either way you look at it, it should be really obvious if something is a parallelogram or not. Opposite sides, looking at the chart, you're skipping a row. We have radical 17 and 3 radical 2. These are not congruent. A look at the slopes, 1/4, -1. Those are not parallel. So there's no way it's a parallelogram. So we can forget about that. Okay, so in terms of this diagram, we can forget about all of these. Okay, it's not any type of parallelogram. That means all that's left is it a trapezoid or is it a kite? Let's just go in order. Is it a trapezoid? Remember, if it's a trapezoid, it will have 1 pair of parallel sides. Exactly 1 pair. Okay, so let's look back. Now we're asking ourselves if it's a trapezoid or not. If we're talking parallel, we should be looking at the slopes. If lines are parallel, the slopes should be the same. So I'm looking and I see, aha, 4 and 4. Those slopes are the same. That means that these sides are parallel. QR and PS are parallel. So I do have 1 pair of parallel sides. I do not have 2. We already established that. Otherwise, it would have been a parallelogram. So, ding, ding, ding. 1 pair of parallel sides. I know this is a trapezoid. So it's just a matter of, I can go ahead and write down trapezoid right now. Trapezoid. Okay, but I have to be careful. It might be an isosceles trapezoid. That would be more specific. So if it's isosceles, I better figure that out and write down isosceles. Okay, of course, an isosceles, ignore the 53. That has nothing to do with it. If it's isosceles, the 2 legs, the non-parallel sides, should be the same. Congruent. So let's look back and see. Now these red ones that I already circled, those are the parallel sides. Okay, so if this is going to be isosceles, the non-parallel sides need to be the same. Those are called the legs. So these 2 are the non-parallel sides. This is a leg and this is a leg. Okay, because they're the non-parallel ones. Radical 17, 3 radical 2. They are not the same. That means this is not isosceles. So my final answer is trapezoid. Not isosceles trapezoid, just trapezoid. Okay, so that's number 1. Alright, let's go on to number 2. Alright, back to ground zero. Before we look at any of this stuff down here, we're asking ourselves, parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Again, looking at the pictures, if it's a parallelogram, opposite sides should be parallel and congruent. So let's start with that. Is it a parallelogram? Yeah, well, all the sides are congruent. And look at these opposite sides. 2, negative 2. I mean 2, 2. Negative 2, negative 2. Opposite sides are parallel. So this is definitely a parallelogram. So right there, I can forget about trapezoids and kites. Okay, it's going to be one of these 4 things. It's either going to just be a parallelogram, or it'll be a rectangle, or a rhombus, or a square. Okay, it's going to be one of these, but I got to be real careful. So it's a parallelogram. Next, we look down and decide, okay, is it a rectangle or a rhombus? Let's start with rhombus. Looking at these lengths, do you think this is a rhombus? Well, yeah. Rhombus. A rhombus is the one that has 4 congruent sides, like this. All the same. So looking at these lengths, that's definitely a rhombus. Okay, so right there, I can forget about ever calling this a parallelogram. And I can forget about calling this a rectangle. Okay, I'm on the rhombus track now. So I'm down to either I'm going to call this a rhombus, or I can get even more specific and call this a square. So I have to be careful. I'm not going to just say rhombus. There's one more option. It could be a square and having all the sides the same. So a rhombus has all 4 sides the same. A square has all 4 sides the same. So what's the difference? Well, look at it. A square has 4 right angles. A rhombus doesn't have to have that. So that's what I have to look at next. So the choice is between rhombus or square. Now, if I want to know if something is a square, this is one of the key things that a lot of kids are struggling to understand. You seem to understand that if I want parallel sides, I need the slopes to be the same. But if I'm talking about right angles, which is what I need for a square, that's perpendicular. Okay, consecutive sides, sides that are right next to each other, should be perpendicular. Do you remember how perpendicular slopes look? I'm hoping the phrase opposite sign reciprocal is popping into your mind. So looking at these slopes, consecutive slopes, like these two for example, are these the slopes of perpendicular lines? Are they opposite sign? Are they reciprocal? Well, they are opposite sign, but they're not reciprocal. If it was reciprocal, it'd be like -1/2 instead of just -2. Okay, so they're not reciprocal, which means that it is not perpendicular. That means this cannot be a square. So we will stop at rhombus. Okay, so everyone should have had rhombus for number 2. Alright, you see all the sides are the same, but they're not perpendicular looking at the slope, so we can't, if you put square, that's why you lost points, because it's not opposite reciprocal. That's what it takes to be a square. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Okay, let's reset. Alright, number 3. Look at this mess, man. Once again, start with these 3 choices. Is it a parallelogram? Is it a trapezoid? Is it a kite? Start with parallelogram. If it's a parallelogram, opposite sides should be parallel. Looking at these two, 0 and 0, that's looking pretty good. But then what about these two opposite sides? Okay, these are not the same. So that means these are not parallel. So that means it's not a parallelogram. So I can forget about parallelograms. So once again, I can just throw out this entire package. So I move on over and ask myself, is it a trapezoid? Okay. Well, a trapezoid has one pair of parallel sides. So looking at the 0 and the 0, there is one pair of parallel sides. Okay? So this is definitely a trapezoid. So I'm going to go ahead and write down trapezoid right now. Okay? These sides are parallel because 0 and 0, they both have the same slope. These are the bases. Okay, this is a base and this is a base. Okay, so similar to what happened on problem number 1, but again I left space up here because I have to ask myself. I know it's a trapezoid, alright, which means it's not a kite either. But maybe it's an isosceles trapezoid. Alright, ignore the 53. Isosceles trapezoid is what it will be if the legs, the non-parallel sides, are the same, congruent. So these red ones are the bases, the parallel sides. So I'm going to mark the other ones in blue. Okay, so these are the non-parallel sides, legs, leg. Is this isosceles? Well, yeah. 2 radical 5, 2 radical 5. The legs are the same. So this is isosceles. Okay, so if you just put trapezoid and you did not put isosceles, you lost points. Okay, so make sure you follow through all the way. By the way, as we are preparing for what it's going to be on the test, okay, on this quiz I didn't have you guys write explanations, I didn't have you write what it is not, but let's practice that. Back on number 2, when we said this was a rhombus, we stopped at rhombus and we did not go to square. So on the test you're going to have to indicate why. So just like I circled these, and I would go ahead and say not square. Okay, because these were not opposite and reciprocal. On this one I stopped at trapezoid. I did not go to isosceles trapezoid. So I need to indicate somehow why I did not go to isosceles trapezoid. So I could do like this, pointing at these 2 legs here, and I can say not isosceles. Okay, anyway, let's move on to number 4. Reset. Once again, look at the top 3. Is it a parallelogram? Is it a trapezoid? Is it a kite? Start with parallelogram. If it's a parallelogram, opposite sides should be parallel. Okay, I'm talking about opposite sides. Okay, these would be the slopes of opposite sides, for example. Okay, and these would also be opposite sides. 2/5, 8/5, those are not the same. Opposite sides are not parallel. So this is not a parallelogram. So once again, I can throw out all the parallelograms. So next, I move over and ask myself, is it a trapezoid? A trapezoid has one pair of parallel sides. Well, those sides are not parallel. These are not parallel either. None of the slopes are the same. So that means it's not a trapezoid. Trapezoid has to have one pair of parallel sides. Okay, I didn't put any ones on here that were just none of the above. So that just leaves kite, since I didn't put any none of the above. So you kind of know it's going to be a kite, but nevertheless, remember a kite should have consecutive sides congruent. Two pairs of sides that are right next to each other which are congruent. So looking on the chart, so we need to look on the lengths. If this is a kite, we should see two pairs of congruent sides right next to each other. Look at that. Radical 29, radical 29, radical 89, radical 89. Two pairs of consecutive sides congruent. That's why this is definitely a kite. Notice that a kite doesn't have any parallel sides. Something to watch out for. Okay, moving on to number 5. Reset. Okay, as always, parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Let's start with parallelogram. Is number 5 a parallelogram? Well, definition of a parallelogram is the opposite sides should be parallel. These two are parallel. What about these two? These two are also parallel. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. That means this is definitely a parallelogram. Okay? That means it's not a trapezoid, it's not a kite. It's going to be either parallelogram or a rectangle or a rhombus or a square. It's going to be one of these four over here. So we got parallelogram so far. Now it's time to ask ourselves, let's move straight down this chart. Is it a rectangle or a rhombus? That's where we go to next. Well, let's talk about rhombus real quick. Look at these lengths. Is this a rhombus? No. If this were a rhombus, all these lengths would be the same. So we know it's not a rhombus. Okay? So we can forget about rhombus. Okay? So that just leaves rectangle. So maybe it's a rectangle. Now, if it's going to be a rectangle, the thing that we need is 90-degree angles. Remember? I should look at that again. A rectangle has 4 90-degree angles. That means consecutive sides should be perpendicular. Do you remember how perpendicular slopes are supposed to look? They should be opposite and reciprocal. Okay? This is what I'm talking about. Consecutive sides, like these right here. If this is a rectangle, these should be opposite and reciprocal. Are they? Yeah. Positive, negative. 2, 1/2. These are opposite sign and reciprocal. Okay, that means this is definitely a rectangle. Okay? So we know it's a rectangle. So, is it a square? Well, we already eliminated rhombus, so it's not a square. It doesn't have 4 equal sides. So rectangle is the best we can do. So everybody should have had rectangle for that one. Okay? But since we are not going all the way to square, you know, I'm crossing that out. Since we're not going down to square, I need to say why I'm not going to square. Okay? The thing that tells me that this is not a square, for example, are lengths like these. If this were a square, all 4 of these lengths would be the same. So I could just circle this and say not square. Okay, let's look at number 6. back to the beginning. Parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Let's start with parallelogram. Okay, looking at this data. Is this a parallelogram? Well, I can already see, pardon my yawn, that all the lengths are the same. That means the opposite sides are the same. Look at these slopes. 2, 2, negative 1/2, negative 1/2. This is a parallelogram. You can probably look ahead and already see that this is going to be a rhombus. In fact, at least a rhombus. But let's stay organized, okay? It's a parallelogram. That means it's not a trapezoid. It's not a kite. You see, at a glance, once we see a parallelogram, we start asking ourselves, okay, is it a rhombus? Is it a rectangle? Is it a square? Rhombus, we already saw that, but all those are the same. So yes, it's a rhombus. Okay, so we have to keep looking. Now we know it's a rhombus. Maybe it's a square. So we have to keep looking and ask ourselves, is it a square? Again, square has those 90-degree angles. If it's going to be a square, perpendicular, okay, consecutive sides should be perpendicular. Do you remember how perpendicular slopes are supposed to look? If this is going to be a square, then these consecutive slopes should be opposite sine and reciprocal. Well, it's the same deal as the last time. So they are opposite sine and reciprocal. So this is a square. Okay, so if you just said rhombus, you lost points. Alright, it's not just a rhombus, it is a square because it has 90-degree angles. Okay, and it's important to note, you really can't just look at just two of them. It has to be all four that are 90-degree angles. So let me make this clear. See, the 2 and the negative 1/2, yes, those are perpendicular. But I should be able to circle any pair, okay, that are consecutive. So like these two are perpendicular. These two are perpendicular. Even these two, okay, the one at the beginning and the very end, those are consecutive. It wraps around. So those would be considered consecutive sides. And they also are opposite and reciprocal. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It has to work all over the place. So anyway, that one was a square. Okay, almost done. Let's look at number 7. Back to the beginning. Parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Start with parallelogram. Is this a parallelogram? No, it is not a parallelogram. Alright, opposite sides. Look at these. 1/3, 2. If this were a parallelogram, these would be the same. And they're not. So it's not a parallelogram. That means it is not any of these parallelograms. I can forget about rectangle, rhombus, and square. So it's either going to be a trapezoid, isosceles trapezoid, or a kite. Let's do trapezoid next. Trapezoid has one pair of parallel sides. Okay, so is it a trapezoid? Okay, well these were not parallel, but what about these? Negative 1/2, negative 1/2. Those are parallel, okay? So QR and PS are parallel. So this is a trapezoid. So I can go ahead and write down trapezoid. Trapezoid. I left space at the top because maybe it's isosceles. Maybe not. How do I tell? Well, I look at the non-parallel sides now. Okay, these are the parallel sides, so that means these are the non-parallel sides, the legs. Leg, leg. Is this isosceles? No, it is not. The two legs are not congruent. So we have to stop with just trapezoid for number 7. If you put isosceles trapezoid, then you lost some points. It is not isosceles. The legs are not congruent. Okay, let's go on to number 8. Alright, once again, first we ask ourselves the top 3. Is it a parallelogram, is it a trapezoid, or is it a kite? So looking at number 8, is this a parallelogram, first of all? Okay, let's look at opposite sides. Boom, boom. Hey, those are parallel. Okay, so far so good. Maybe it's a parallelogram. Let's look at the other pair of opposite sides. This and this. Hey, look at that. Those are parallel too. We have both pairs of opposite sides parallel. That means this is a parallelogram. That means one of these are going to be the answer. Alright, so it's not a trapezoid, it's not a kite. So if you put any of those, you messed up early. Alright, so we know it's a parallelogram. Now we ask ourselves, is it a rectangle, is it a rhombus? We can eliminate rhombus right away, can't we? Why? How do I know this is definitely not a rhombus? Well, a rhombus has all 4 sides congruent. Alright, so not a rhombus, which means it's not a square either, because a square would have all 4 sides congruent. So the only possible choices at this point are parallelogram or rectangle. That's it. Parallelogram or rectangle, all that's left. The way I know rectangle is perpendicular. Okay, 90 degrees, that's what a rectangle has. The consecutive sides should be perpendicular, opposite and reciprocal. Okay, look at these slopes. Alright, as I look at a pair of consecutive slopes, are these opposite sign reciprocals? No, they are not. They're opposite sign, but they're not reciprocal. This is 3 over 2. The reciprocal would be 2 over 3. It's not what's happening. So, in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and say not rectangle. Okay, it's not a rectangle. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and say why it's not a rhombus either. Not rhombus. Alright? Don't forget to say what these things are not. If you do not move on to the lower level, when we say it's not a rhombus, we have to mention it. If we're not going on down to rectangle, we have to mention it. So it's not a rhombus because of these lengths are not the same. It's not a rectangle because these are not opposite reciprocals. So we stopped at parallelogram. Okay, back here at number 7, I forgot to say why we did not go to trapezoid. I mean, I said it verbally, but I forgot to mark it. So let's not forget to mark it. Again, I can just draw these like arrows like this, and I can say this is why it is not isosceles. Alright, because of these legs right here. Alright, last 2. Looking at number 9. Once again, okay, parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Keep coming back to that. Okay, let's start with this. Is it a parallelogram? If it's a parallelogram, the opposite side should be parallel. Are the opposite sides parallel, man? Well, these are opposite sides. Those are parallel. Okay. What about the other ones? Negative 1/4, negative 1/4. Those are parallel too. So guess what? Number 9 is a parallelogram. So far, so good. Alright, so some kind of parallelogram. It means it's not a trapezoid, it's not a kite. So it's going to be one of these 4 shapes. Let's talk rhombus rectangle next. That's the next level down, rhombus rectangle. Okay, so I already know it's a parallelogram, so let me erase some of this. Let's talk rhombus. Is this a rhombus? No. If this were a rhombus, these would all be the same. They're not. So again, we should indicate why we are not going the next level down. So I'm just going to circle these 2 and write not rhombus. Okay, on your test you will have to do this. So it's not a rhombus. So it's a parallelogram, and that means it's not a square either. So the only choices are now either I'm going to stick with parallelogram or I'm going to go rectangle. The way I will know it's a rectangle is by looking at the slopes. If this is going to be a rectangle has 90 degrees. That's perpendicular. The consecutive sides should be perpendicular. Looking at these slopes, that means they should be opposite and reciprocal. Uh-oh. Okay, so if this is going to be a rectangle, these consecutive slopes should be opposite and reciprocal. And they are opposite and reciprocal. Again, let's be careful though. It takes more than just one. You can have one 90-degree angle, and then maybe the other ones aren't 90 degrees. So let's keep looking at other consecutive slopes. So these are also opposite and reciprocal. And these are also opposite and reciprocal. Okay, all of the consecutive, even the ones on the ends, the 4 and the negative 1/4 on the top and the bottom, every consecutive pair is opposite and reciprocal. That means this is a rectangle. Okay, so it's hold on. So this is definitely a rectangle. Okay, I don't suppose I really needed to write that it's not a rhombus. It's a rectangle. I need to write why it's not a square. So I really should be putting not square here. It's all about indicating why you are not going down the next level. Okay, so here I'm already at I'm at rectangle, so I have to say why I'm not going down further to square. I don't need to say why I didn't go sideways over here. Anyway, it's a rectangle. That's the bottom line. If you just put parallelogram, you lost points. Okay, last one. Number 10. Okay, once again, you have to ask yourself, look at those top 3. Is it a parallelogram? Is it a trapezoid? Is it a kite? Let's start with parallelogram. Okay, look at this very carefully. If this is a parallelogram, opposite sides should be parallel. Also, opposite sides should be congruent. Alright, make sure you are looking at opposite sides, not consecutive sides or anything like that. So for example, these would be opposite sides, 4 and 1/4. Are these parallel? No, they are not. I have 4 and 1/4. So right there, I can see that this is not a parallelogram. So if you put parallelogram, even though these opposite sides are not parallel. Some of you guys were looking at the consecutive sides, I guess, like the 4 radical 17 and the 4 radical. Those are consecutive sides, not opposite sides. So it's not a parallelogram. That means it's not any of these parallelograms. Okay, it's not a rhombus, it's not a rectangle, it's not a square. So the only possible options so far are trapezoid and kite. Okay, so let's move on to trapezoid. This pair of opposite sides was not parallel. But what about the other pair? Because it only takes one pair of parallel sides to be a trapezoid. So if I look at the other pair of opposite sides, I've got -1/4 and -4. They're not the same either. Okay, that means it's not a trapezoid. So we can forget about trapezoids. That means the only thing that's left is a kite. So since none of these were none of the above, then this one's going to turn out to be a kite. Alright, well let's go ahead and break it down and make it real clear why it is a kite. Remember, if it's going to be a kite, it should have two pairs of consecutive sides that are the same. Not opposite sides, but the ones right next to each other should be congruent. Okay, so looking back at our chart, please understand that these two right here are consecutive sides. Okay, 4 radical 17 and 4 radical. See how they're right next to each other on the chart? Those are consecutive sides that are the same. That's just what you would expect from a kite. Okay, this could be our 4 radical 17. Let me see what's going on here. Then we have radical 17. Okay, yeah, this could be our 4 radical 17 and 4 radical 17 right here. Alright, right next to each other, consecutive. Now what about these other ones? Now remember that this wraps around. When you're looking at a picture, you know, PQRS or whatever, it goes around and around like a circle. So that means when I look at this chart, the PQ and the PS, they are consecutive, you know, because it wraps around. It goes side to side to side to side and then back to the start again. So when you're looking for your consecutive sides, please understand that the one at the beginning and the end of a chart, they are consecutive. So these two are just as much right next to each other as QR and RS are. Okay. So that's another pair of consecutive sides that are the same. So we do have two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. So it makes sense that this is a kite. And that's it. That's the quiz.